Arctic ignition. The howling wind was a banshee, clawing at the window panes, flinging crystalline snow against the glass like 1,000 tiny needles. Outside, the world was a canvas of monochrome, stark white, slate gray, and the deepening blue of a winter twilight. Inside, however, a different kind of storm was brewing, a tempest of anticipation that hummed in the very air of their secluded cabin. The fireplace crackled, a defiant orange heart against the encroaching chill, casting dancing shadows that promised more than mere warmth. His phone lay inert on the bedside table, a silent monument to disconnection, its airplane mode a sacred vow, no disturbance. The only flight on their itinerary would be a rocket to the moon, a journey fueled by something far more potent than jet propellant. He'd meticulously orchestrated this weekend getaway, a 2-night Odyssey dedicated solely to the singular pursuit of them. A soft click echoed from the adjoining room, a sound like a fuse being lit. He watched, breath held, as she emerged from the shadows, a vision in crimson. The short dress was a second skin, a daring testament to the curves it so exquisitely hugged, a scarlet siren call against the backdrop of the crackling fire. It moved with her, a liquid flame, ending high on her thighs, leaving acres of bare skin to the imagination and his hungry gaze. Her legs, sculpted perfection, culminated in the lethal grace of stiletto heels, each click on the polished wood floor a rhythmic heartbeat, a prelude to the symphony of sighs he knew would soon follow. There was nothing else on, no inhibitions, no reservations, just the audacious confidence of a woman ready to ignite. Her eyes, dark pools reflecting the firelight, met his. A silent language passed between them, a primal understanding that transcended words. It was more than desire, it was an intense rage to please, a mutual hunger that gnawed at their very core. He felt the insistent throb of it, a visceral demand to consume and be consumed. As she drew closer, the air crackled with an almost tangible electricity. He reached for her, his hands a compass tracing the soft lines of her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The silk of her dress was cool for a fleeting second before his body heat began its slow, inevitable conquest. She leaned into him, her scent, a heady mix of subtle perfume and burgeoning arousal, filling his senses, a potent elixir that went straight to his head. His fingers, with a deliberate slowness that was almost torture, found the hem of her dress. He began to pull it upwards, the soft fabric caressing her skin one last time before yielding. Her hands met his, not to resist, but to guide, to participate in the ceremonial shedding. The dress shimmied up, past her hips, past her waist, until it bunched at her shoulders, a discarded skin. Then, with a gasp, he pulled it over her head, letting it fall to the floor like a crimson petal, revealing the full glory of her bare form beneath. She stood before him, bathed in the flickering firelight, a living statue carved from desire, her skin glowing like polished ivory. He buried his face in the nape of her neck, inhaling deeply, his lips finding the tender hollow beneath her ear. A shiver coursed through her, a tremor of pure sensation. His hands slid down her back, charting the delicate ridge of her spine, the soft curve of her derriere. With a gentle but firm grip, he tangled his fingers in her hair, pulling her head back just enough to expose her throat, a vulnerable offering. Her breath hitched, a soft moan escaping her lips as he kissed the pulse point, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against his mouth. "My heat," he whispered, his voice a low rumble, "is for you, and yours for me." He turned her slightly, stroking her from the back, his thumbs tracing circles on her lower back, coaxing her hips to undulate against his. The cold outside was a forgotten myth. The only reality was the burgeoning inferno within. Her body, already a molten core of desire, was dripping with an eagerness that ignited his own like rocket fuel. The rage to please was a silent roar in his ears, driving every touch, every breath, every whispered word. The morning after their initial fiery launch was a study in profound stillness. The blizzard had exhausted its fury, leaving the world outside vacuum-sealed in a blanket of pristine white under a sky the color of washed-out steel. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the soft hiss and pop of embers dying in the hearth and the synchronized rhythm of their breathing. He lay awake, watching her sleep, her body curled into his, a map of contentment he could spend a lifetime exploring. The crimson dress lay in a defeated pool on the floor, a relic of a battle gloriously won. But this was a war of pleasure, and they were both victors. The rage to please from the night before had not vanished, it had transformed. The explosive energy had cooled into a dense, gravitational pull, a certainty that held them in a shared orbit. This was no longer about a rocket launch. It was about the silent, weightless drift through the cosmos that follows. The part of the journey where you simply float, mesmerized by the vast, beautiful emptiness and the singular, brilliant star that is your companion. He shifted slightly, and her eyes fluttered open, dark and deep, holding none of the sleep fog of a normal morning. They were clear, lucid, as if she had been awake with him all along, navigating the same celestial currents in her dreams. A slow smile graced her lips, a silent acknowledgement of the new territory they had charted together. No words were needed. The language of last night, of touch, of breath, of shared climax, had rewritten their code. They spent the day in a state of luxurious isolation, their own private snow globe. They made coffee, their movements languid and easy, their bodies brushing past each other in the small kitchen with an unhurried intimacy. They sat by the window, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the pale sun cast long blue shadows across the snowdrifts. He read to her from an old book of poetry he'd found on the shelf, his voice a low counterpoint to the silence. The words were about love and stars and eternity, and they felt less like fiction and more like a documentary of their own burgeoning reality. As dusk began to reclaim the sky, painting it in hues of violet and rose, a different kind of energy began to build. It wasn't the frenetic, crackling electricity of the previous night. This was slower, deeper, like the turning of a galaxy. He rebuilt the fire, the logs catching with a satisfying whoosh, and she disappeared into the bedroom. He waited, his heart a steady, powerful drum. This time there was no pretense, no siren's call of a scarlet dress. When she emerged, she was gloriously, unashamedly bare. Her skin, warmed by the firelight, seemed to absorb the glow, radiating a soft luminescence. She was not a siren tonight. She was a celestial body, a planet in her own right, with tides and seasons and a core of molten heat he was privileged to explore. Her stilettos were gone, her feet bare against the wood floor, grounding her, making her approach more deliberate, more vulnerable. He rose to meet her, his own shirt already discarded. He didn't pull her to him in a rush. Instead, he stopped a foot away, drinking her in, honoring the space between them before closing it. He raised his hands, not to touch her skin, but to hover them an inch away, from her shoulders down to her hips. He could feel the heat radiating from her, a tangible force, an aura of pure want. She shivered, not from cold, but from the exquisite torture of that near contact. Her eyes closed, her head tilting back in surrender. "Last night," he whispered, his voice thick with the day's unspoken emotions, "was the launch. Tonight, we float." He finally let his palms make contact, smoothing over the planes of her back, the curve of her waist, the swell of her hips. It was not a grasp of possession, but a touch of reverence. He led her, not to the rug, but to the large, fur-lined chair facing the fire. He sat, pulling her down onto his lap, her back against his chest so they could both watch the flames. He wrapped his arms around her, one hand splayed across her stomach, the other tracing lazy, hypnotic circles over her thigh. This was a different kind of passion. It was the slow burn of absolute trust. He kissed her shoulder, her neck, the delicate shell of her ear, whispering to her about the beauty he saw, not just in her body, but in the fierce, brilliant light of her soul. Her breath hitched, her body melting against his, her head resting back against his shoulder. His hands began a slow, meticulous exploration, learning the textures of her skin, the response of her muscles, the secrets her body told without words. He was not stoking a fire, he was mapping a constellation. The rage to please was now a quiet, unwavering focus. His pleasure was secondary, a byproduct derived entirely from hers. He brought her to the edge time and again, a gentle, rhythmic push and pull, like the tide drawn by an unseen moon. Her quiet gasps were the only sounds that punctuated the crackling of the fire. She was adrift, lost in a sea of sensation he had created just for her. As the true deep night settled, and the fire burned down to glowing orange coals, something shifted outside. A faint, ethereal green began to dance at the edges of the window. The Aurora Borealis. He paused, turning her face gently toward the glass. Her eyes, wide with wonder and slick with unshed tears of pleasure, reflected the celestial light show. The sky was alive, shimmering curtains of green and purple light swaying in a silent cosmic ballet. "It's for you," he murmured against her temple, his body still moving with that slow, deep rhythm. In that moment, everything converged. The primal heat within, the cosmic beauty without. Her body arched, a final shuddering release that was not a violent explosion, but a silent, beautiful nova. A wave of light and energy that washed through her and through him. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, as her aftershocks subsided. His own release a deep, quiet confirmation of their shared space. They stayed there for a long time, wrapped together in the dark, watching the heavens dance. They had moved beyond the frantic need for ignition. They were now in orbit, a two-body system held together by a force more fundamental than gravity, circling a shared center of Polaris Prime, their own North Star. The journey was far from over. It had just found its true, unwavering direction. The second morning dawned with a crystalline clarity that felt profound. The aurora had faded with the first hints of light, but its phantom energy seemed to have infused the very air of the cabin. A new silence settled between them, deeper than the one before. It was the silence of complete understanding, of a connection forged in both fire and starlight. They moved through the day with a telepathic grace, their needs anticipated, their thoughts seemingly shared. The rage to please had now evolved into its final, most potent form, a sublime and total surrender to the inevitability of their union. He knew, as he watched her across the small wooden table sipping her tea, that this third and final night was not about a new destination. It was not about launching or orbiting. It was about arriving at a place from which there was no return. It was the event horizon, that theoretical boundary around a singularity where gravity becomes so strong that nothing, not even light, can escape. Tonight they would cross it, together. The day was spent preparing the vessel, not with grand gestures, but with small, intimate rituals. They braved the cold for a short walk, their boots crunching in the snow, their breath misting and mingling in the frigid air. The world was vast and white and silent, and it felt like they were the only two souls left in existence. Back inside, he built the fire into a roaring inferno, a stark contrast to the deliberate calm that had taken hold of him. She laid out blankets and pillows before it, creating a soft altar in the heart of their sanctuary. As twilight bled across the snow, turning it a bruised purple,
The finality of the moment hung in the air, thick and heavy with portent. There was no artifice left, no clothes, no roles, just the raw, unvarnished truth of their two bodies and the single, unified will that now drove them. He came to her where she knelt by the fire, the flames painting her skin in flickering shades of gold and bronze. He didn't speak. He simply knelt behind her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. It was a touch of immense weight and meaning. It was not a question, but a statement. I am here. I will hold you. I will guide you. Trust me. She leaned back into his touch, her head falling back to rest against his chest, a gesture of absolute faith. This was the culmination of his need to give and her need to receive, a perfect symbiotic loop. He slowly turned her to face him, his eyes locking with hers. In their depths he saw not just desire, but a fierce, brilliant courage. She was ready to fall with him. He laid her down gently on the nest of blankets, his body covering hers like a shield. His movements were slow, deliberate, each touch a carefully chosen word in a sacred vow. He kissed her, not with the frantic hunger of the first night or the gentle reverence of the second, but with a deep, soul-consuming finality. It was a kiss that sealed a pact, a promise to obliterate the space that remained between them. His hands roamed her body, but this time they were not just exploring. They were claiming, charting, and erasing. He was learning the very edge of her, the boundary where she ended and the world began, with the sole intention of dissolving it. His mouth followed, a slow, burning path down her throat, over her collarbones, to the frantic heart that beat a drum solo against her ribs. "There is no you," he whispered, his breath hot against her skin. "There is no me, not anymore." She didn't answer with words. She answered by arching into him, her fingers digging into his back, pulling him closer, urging him onward, deeper. She was an active participant in this dissolution, pulling him into her own gravitational field with as much force as he exerted on her. This was not submission. It was a conscious, willful act of merging. He moved within her, and the universe within the cabin contracted to a single point of sensation. The crackling fire, the howling wind that had begun to pick up again outside, the very concept of the world beyond their walls, it all ceased to exist. There was only the friction, the heat, the inexorable pull toward the center. Their rhythm was not a frantic race, but a powerful, relentless tide, pulling them further and further from the shore of their individual selves. The pleasure was so intense it bordered on pain, a beautiful, searing agony that stripped away every last defense. Her moans were no longer just sounds of ecstasy. They were the sounds of a soul being unmade and reformed. He felt his own identity fracturing, the carefully constructed walls of his ego crumbling into dust. The rage to please had reached its zenith, to love her so completely that he would cease to be, allowing them to become a new, singular entity. The climax, when it came, was not an explosion. It was an implosion. It was the silent, violent, and complete collapse of a star into a singularity. There was a moment of absolute white light behind his closed eyes, a deafening silence that consumed all sound, and the sensation of falling endlessly into a warm, dark void. Their bodies shuddered in unison, a single organism convulsing in the throes of its own creation. For an immeasurable time afterward, they lay entwined, motionless, breathless. The fire had burned down to a soft, pulsating glow. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, but it felt like his own. He couldn't tell where his skin ended and hers began. They had crossed the event horizon. They had fallen past the point of no return. The world could reclaim them in the morning, but it would be reclaiming something new, something that had been irrevocably and magnificently altered in the heart of the Arctic night. They were one.
The final morning arrived not with a whisper, but with a declaration. Sunlight, sharp and brilliant, speared through the cabin window, striking dust motes that danced in its rays like tiny newborn galaxies. The storm was a distant memory. The sky was an impossibly deep, cloudless blue. The world outside was reborn, blanketed in a diamond-dusted silence. Inside, so were they. There was a profound peace in the cabin, the kind of quiet that follows a cataclysmic event. They awoke tangled in the blankets before the cold hearth, their bodies bearing the languid, well-used ache of their journey. He looked at her, truly looked at her in the unforgiving morning light, and saw not a single flaw. The shadows of the fire had been replaced by the honest glow of the sun, and she was more beautiful than ever. The remnants of their shared singularity still hummed between them, a low-frequency current that bound them more tightly than any physical embrace. Packing was a slow, deliberate ballet. Each item they folded and placed into their bags felt significant. A piece of clothing, a book, the empty bottle of wine from the first night. They were artifacts from a different time, a different reality. They moved around each other with an economy of motion, an innate understanding of each other's space that hadn't existed 3 days ago. Words were sparse, unnecessary. A shared glance over the rim of a coffee cup conveyed more than a soliloquy. He found her standing by the window, looking out at the snow-laden pines. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood there, watching their own breath fog the cold glass. "Are you ready for re-entry?" he asked, his voice soft. She leaned her head back against his. "I don't think we ever left orbit. I think we just brought it with us." It was the perfect summation. The cabin had been their vessel, their launch pad, their cosmic sanctuary. But the journey itself, the ignition, the deep space drift, the terrifying and beautiful fall into the singularity had happened within them. That was something they would carry forever. The Arctic was not a place they were leaving behind. It was a part of their very fabric now. He carried their bags to the car, the cold air a bracing shock after the warmth of the cabin. The engine turned over with a roar that seemed profane in the sacred silence. As he waited for her, he glanced at his phone, still on the bedside table. For 3 days, that small, dark rectangle had been a symbol of their glorious isolation. Now it was a portal back to the world of deadlines, notifications, and demands. It was the airlock. She emerged, locking the cabin door behind her with a soft click. She walked to the car, her eyes meeting his through the windshield. There was no sadness in her expression, only a calm, unshakable certainty. She got in, the scent of her, of wood smoke and woman, and the undefinable musk of their shared journey filling the small space. He picked up his phone. He held it for a moment, then switched off airplane mode. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the deluge. A cascade of notifications, emails, texts, and voicemails flooded the screen. The silent cabin was suddenly filled with the pings and buzzes of a world that had continued to spin without them. It felt alien, intrusive, like meaningless static from a forgotten planet. He looked at her. She was watching him, her expression unreadable but for the deep, knowing light in her eyes. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his soul. Without looking at the screen again, he tossed the phone into the back seat, the sounds of the outside world muffled amongst the luggage. He reached across the console and took her hand. Her fingers laced with his, a perfect, seamless fit. It was the only connection that mattered. He put the car in gear and they pulled away from the cabin, leaving a single set of tire tracks in the immaculate snow. They didn't look back. There was no need.
Their past was the fuel, their present was the vessel, and their future was the vast, open, starlit territory stretching out before them. The rocket had not just completed its mission, it had become their new reality. Their flight hadn't ended. They were simply heading for a new sky, together, forever in their own celestial dawn.